Is vaping nicotine actually more dangerous than smoking it? And does it depend on which type of vape that you're actually using? So today I'll explain the science behind what we know and what we don't know on smoking versus vaping nicotine from a drug scientist who has published over a dozen papers on the topic of nicotine. So weirdly, public opinion has been changing about how safe vaping is in comparison to smoking. So for a while there, we're like, yeah, vaping definitely is better than smoking. And then a whole bunch of people started vaping, and then kind of public opinion changed. Basically, now the majority of people think vaping is more harmful than smoking, but the literature suggests something different. So let me explain all of the different aspects of this. But first, if you get nothing from this video, I want you to understand this point. The point that I want to make is not that vaping is harmless. Vaping is not harmless, and I am not going to ever say that vaping is harmless. In fact, I will say that no drug is harmless. Vaping is safer than smoking, and let me explain that in a little bit. But also, it is not safe. People should not just start vaping out of nowhere. A lot of people who are in the dual users category, so who both vape and smoke. So for example, they might smoke the majority of the day, but then in situations in which they can't smoke, they will vape instead. So vaping is more easily accessible than smoking, and so they might decide to just kind of use the other one when it benefits them most to be able to get that nicotine fix. And there are a lot of people who vape to quit smoking. So what's happening is that it's very hard to find these groups of people who are purely vapors or purely smokers. And what we actually see is that those dual users, people who both smoke and vape, they have worse health outcomes than pretty much everybody. So dual using, smoking while vaping is actually the worst for you in terms of like the health consequences. And let me detail some of these health consequences. So I'm going to start with number of deaths, and this is going to seem ridiculous because it is ridiculous to talk about number of deaths, but this is a valid way of talking about how dangerous a drug is. So what we see is that, yeah, there are like 500,000 deaths per year in the United States from smoking, and across the world, we have millions of people who die from smoking. But in terms of vaping, we don't see that many deaths. In fact, in one of the biggest outbreaks, so the EVALI outbreak where they looked at vaping-associated lung injury, that was 68 people with over 1,000 that ended up hospitalized. And that was like a big deal in the vaping side, but we're talking about multiple times that in terms of yearly deaths due to smoking. But if I just gave you that statistic, you'd be like, okay, but we've not been vaping that long. You are correct. And this is the major problem here, and that we don't know what the long-term effects are. So smoking typically leads to chronic injury and illness, which then leads to death. It's not like you just smoke one cigarette and die. So we need to compare long-term smoking to long-term vaping. And the problem is that we don't really have that data as of right now. So we basically only have 20 years of when vaping became a thing. It became more popular in 2010. So now we only have like 15, 16 years of evidence. And then we only started with like Juuls when it started becoming really popular in 2015. We don't have the decades of vaping to see if it causes long-term injury. So what do we have? Well, let's talk about each specific health consequence in turn. So let's start with respiratory symptoms. We do see that vaping is linked to respiratory problems. So we see that there's an increase in things like wheezing and shortness of breath for people who vape. But we also see those in people who smoke as well. And we see that the lung cancer risk for people who smoke is much, much, much higher than the people who vape. What about the actual harmful like constituents, the things that you're actually smoking, the chemicals that are actually in the product? We see that tobacco has far more harmful and potentially harmful constituents than vaping does. There have been outbreaks of these bigger lung problems. So the vaping-associated lung injury that I mentioned caused 68 deaths, and then there was this thing called popcorn lung that was going around for a while. Popcorn lung is so named because it started in a microwave popcorn factory. So what happened is that this specific chemical, diacetyl, basically was not good when you started actually inhaling it into your lungs. And so it was used as butter flavoring until people were like, oh, I'm getting sick from it and potentially dying because they're using this in the factory that I am part of. So they disallowed that from foods, but then it was part of kind of the original vape juice. Now, the UK and EU has actually banned diacetyl from any sort of use in vape liquids. The United States has not yet, but it requires you to say what's on your package in terms of like the regulated vaping products. So you can check to see if it's in there, and you definitely should not be using an ingredient that contains either vitamin E acetate or diacetyl. Okay, so what about other things? Not popcorn lung, but what about things like COPD? You do find that there's an increased risk in people who vape for COPD. And there's an increased risk for high blood pressure as well, although that's only found in people between the ages of 30 and 70 in this study. But once again, smoking is far worse for the development of COPD and for the development of high blood pressure, and dual users are in much worse condition than cigarette smokers or vapors alone. And then there's this huge meta-analysis that was recently published that basically said, like, there are increased risks for certain types of diseases and decreased risks for others. So in terms of the diseases that had similar risks between vaping and smoking, what you found was that metabolic dysfunction and then specifically things like oral disease were the same in terms of likelihood of risk. Like diabetes risk could be potentially similar between both. But overall risks were lower for things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, COPD, and fetal risk. And asthma risk was lower in vapors than smokers as well. But here's the thing, we've done a lot of this research like very recently. So that review that I was talking about, over 80% of its studies were from the past 5 years. So we're just on this now. And the potential for less harm just kind of decreases day after day after day when you're looking at the data. So initially they said that like vaping was 95% less risky than smoking. And now they're like, okay, we're thinking more like 33% less. We see this with kind of these acute problems. We have studies that look at like 4 years of use and show that those long-term issues are not necessarily as problematic, but we still need the long-term studies. And the modeling studies suggest that there's a decreased risk too, but only if people are not actually starting to vape when they weren't smoking. And we do see that certain different types of vapes matter. So if your vapes contain like the diacetyl, if your vapes contain like vitamin E acetate, you should not be using those. And those are more common in black market vapes. But we don't have basically anything on like the types of vapes out there, like disposable versus non-disposable. Disposable seem to be related to being more dependent on it, but we don't know. All of that's correlational. So our data is messy. We had like a global pandemic and we've had multiple bans and like changing the age of use in the United States, and other countries are trying really hard and doing great things. Like the UK and EU is much better than the US right now. So is vaping less harmful? As of right now, all signs point to yes. But less harmful does not mean harmless.